The candlelight flickers across weathered hands as they trace a route across yellowed parchment. An old sailor, his face carved deep with lines from decades of salt spray and sun, taps his calloused finger against a point in the vast Atlantic. His voice carries the weight of certainty when he speaks of the island there, the one where he once sheltered from a storm, where he filled his barrels with fresh water, where his crew walked on solid ground. But when you look at the chart spread before him, dated from 1749, and then glance at a modern map of the same waters, something impossible confronts you. The island is gone. Not destroyed, not sunken beneath the waves, but simply erased, as if it never drew breath upon the ocean's surface. What if the maps we trusted, the ones that guided empires across uncharted seas, the ones that captains bet their lives and the lives of their crews upon, were lying to us? Not through simple error or crude measurement, but through something far more unsettling. What if entire landmasses vanished, not from the Earth itself, but from reality as we understand it? For centuries, phantom islands appeared on official navigation charts used by the greatest maritime powers the world has ever known. These were not scribbled rumors on tavern napkins or the mad ravings of sun-poisoned sailors. These were carefully drawn features on maps produced by royal cartographers, endorsed by naval academies, reproduced in atlas after atlas, generation after generation. Ships were dispatched specifically to explore them. Expeditions were funded by kings and queens to claim them. Lives were lost searching for their shores. And then, without explanation, they disappeared. In the bitter cold of 1607, Captain James Hall stood at the bow of his ship, scanning the frozen horizons of the North Atlantic for an island that would never be found. His crew huddled below deck, frostbitten fingers wrapped around charts that showed, with absolute cartographic certainty, a landmass called Frisland lying just south of Iceland. What Hall could not have known, as ice formed on his beard and the wind cut through layers of wool and leather, was that he was chasing a phantom, a geographical lie that had already deceived generations of mariners and would continue to haunt maps for another century. The story of Frisland begins not with honest error, but with deliberate fraud. In 1558, two Venetian brothers, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, published what they claimed was a translation of letters written by their ancestors over 2 centuries earlier. These letters described an incredible voyage to the far north, undertaken by their 14th century relatives, also named Niccolo and Antonio Zeno Toil. According to this narrative, the elder Zeno brothers had been shipwrecked off the coast of an island called Frisland around 1380, where they were rescued by a local prince named Zichnai. This mysterious ruler, the account claimed, employed the Venetian brothers as admirals in his fleet, leading them on further expeditions throughout the northern seas, discovering islands and charting unknown territories. The publication included a map, weathered and seemingly ancient, showing not just Frisland but an entire geography of the Arctic that diverged significantly from accepted knowledge. Frisland itself was depicted as a substantial island, nearly as large as Iceland, positioned in the waters between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. The map showed cities, harbors, and a complex coastline suggesting a well-established civilization. It appeared to be exactly what Renaissance Europe craved, confirmation that their ancestors had reached the New World before Columbus, that Italian navigators had charted the Arctic long before the current age of exploration. But the Zeno narrative was a fabrication. Modern scholars have examined the account with forensic precision, finding anachronisms, geographical impossibilities, and suspicious similarities to other published voyage accounts available in 16th century Venice. The language used in the supposedly ancient letters matches 16th century Venetian, not 14th century dialect. The details of the voyage appear to be cobbled together from various legitimate accounts, including descriptions of the Orkney Islands, Greenland, and possibly even early knowledge of North America, all confused and relocated to serve the Zeno brothers' purposes. Why would the Zeno brothers create such an elaborate hoax? The answer lies in the fierce national pride and commercial competition of Renaissance Italy. Venice was losing its dominance in maritime trade, and the Zeno brothers sought to elevate their family status by claiming their ancestors had achieved feats of navigation that rivaled or exceeded those of the Spanish and Portuguese explorers who were currently reshaping the known world. The fabrication worked spectacularly. Scholars, geographers, and rival mapmakers all incorporated Frisland into their work, unable to resist the authority of what appeared to be primary source documentation. The great cartographer Gerardus Mercator, whose maps set the standard for accuracy and influenced navigation for centuries, included Frisland on his world map of 1569. This was not the decision of a gullible amateur but one of history's most respected geographers, lending his immense authority to a fiction. Once Mercator validated Frisland, the island achieved a kind of cartographic immortality. Other mapmakers copied it not because they had independent verification, but because Mercator had included it. Maps became chains of citations, each link adding weight to the falsehood. For sailors and explorers, however, maps were not academic exercises but life and death guides to navigation. When your ship sailed into polar waters where ice could crush hulls like eggshells and winter darkness lasted months, you trusted your charts absolutely. And those charts showed Frisland, marked as clearly as England or France, a promised refuge in hostile seas. Martin Frobisher, searching for the Northwest Passage in 1576, carried maps that showed Frisland. When storms scattered his small fleet and ice threatened to trap his ships, he searched for the island that was supposed to offer shelter. His men suffered from scurvy, their teeth loosening, and old wounds reopening as vitamin deficiency ravaged their bodies. Some died in the frozen darkness, perhaps dreaming of the harbors and settlements of Frisland that lay just beyond the next ice field, always just out of reach. John Davis, another Arctic explorer, sailed in 1585 with explicit instructions to investigate Frisland and determine its exact position. He was a meticulous navigator, careful and rational, not prone to fantasy. Yet even Davis, despite sailing through the very waters where Frisland was charted, found nothing. The absence of evidence, however, did not translate to evidence of absence. The Arctic was vast, visibility was often measured in feet rather than miles, and fog could hide entire coastlines. Davis reported his failure to locate Frisland, but did not conclusively declare it non-existent. How could he? The maps of the world's greatest cartographers all showed it was there. The human cost mounted with each expedition. Ships departed European ports, laden with supplies and staffed by sailors who left behind wives and children, all trusting in the accuracy of their navigational charts. When those ships entered the ice-choked waters south of Iceland, searching for an island that existed only on paper, they entered a geography of delusion. The cold itself became an enemy beyond normal comprehension. Frostbite would blacken fingers and toes, turning flesh into dead matter that had to be amputated with carpenter's saws, often without anything stronger than rum to dull the agony. Men who fell into the Arctic water had mere minutes before hypothermia stopped their hearts. Those who survived described the cold as a living presence, an entity that pressed against the mind as surely as it froze the body. In 1606, Captain John Knight sailed to find Frisland in the Northwest Passage. His ship, the Hopewell, carried a crew of 21 men. Knight disappeared while exploring what he believed might be Frisland's coastline. His crew waited, watching the shore, seeing nothing but ice and rock. When he did not return, they searched, then fled, their numbers already reduced by disease and cold. Knight's frozen body was never recovered. He became one more casualty of a cartographic phantom. The most haunting aspect of Frisland's persistence is that it continued to appear on maps long after explorers had thoroughly charted the waters where it was supposed to exist. By the middle of the 17th century, Dutch and English whalers had traversed the North Atlantic countless times. They knew every island, every shoal, every ice-free harbor. Frisland was nowhere. The absence was absolute and undeniable. Yet mapmakers could not bring themselves to remove it. This reluctance was partly institutional inertia. Cartography workshops employed craftsmen who copied earlier maps, and those earlier maps showed Frisland. Removing it would require explanation, documentation, official announcements. It would require admitting that the great Mercator had been wrong, that generations of scholars had perpetuated an error, that sailors had died searching for a fiction that authorities had endorsed as fact. More disturbing was the psychological dimension. Removing Frisland meant confronting the unreliability of authoritative knowledge. If this island, mapped with such confidence and detail, did not exist, what else might be false? The maps were supposed to represent mastery over the unknown, The triumph of knowledge over chaos. Frisland's removal would be an admission that the known world was smaller and more uncertain than believed, that the authorities who claimed expertise had failed in their fundamental task. So Frisland lingered, gradually fading rather than vanishing. Some mapmakers moved it, shifting its position when reports came back that it wasn't where originally charted. Others made it smaller, less detailed, hedging their bets. A few added question marks or notations, suggesting uncertainty, tiny admissions of doubt that didn't quite rise to the level of deletion. By the early 18th century, Frisland had finally disappeared from most maps, erased not by any dramatic revelation, but by slow, reluctant consensus. The Phantom Island dissolved into the sea from which it had been conjured, leaving behind only footnotes in the history of cartographic errors. But its legacy remained in the sailors' graves scattered across the Arctic, in the widows who waited for ships that never returned, in the children who grew up fatherless because their parents trusted maps that contained beautiful, precise lies. The story of Frisland reveals something profound about human nature and our relationship with authority and knowledge. We want to believe that experts know what they claim to know, that the maps and charts and official documents represent genuine understanding rather than educated guesses and copied errors. The alternative is terrifying, that we are more lost than we think, that the authorities we trust are sometimes wrong in ways they refuse to acknowledge, that admitting error is so psychologically difficult that institutions will perpetuate falsehoods rather than face the shame of correction. Even today, phantom islands appear in our navigation systems. Digital ghosts copied from old charts into modern databases. Sandy Island appeared on Google Maps until 2012, positioned in the Coral Sea near New Caledonia, despite not existing. When a scientific expedition sailed to its coordinates and found only open ocean, the island was finally deleted. How many sailors over the centuries had adjusted their courses to avoid this non-existent hazard? We will never know. Frisland stands as a monument to this peculiar human failing, this inability to admit error even when lives hang in the balance. It reminds us that truth is not determined by consensus among authorities, that official sources can be collectively wrong, and that the courage to say we were mistaken is often more valuable than the pride that perpetuates falsehood. In the frozen waters south of Iceland, where no island ever existed, the ghost of Frisland still whispers a warning. Question your maps, doubt your certainties, and remember that confidence is not the same as accuracy. In the age of exploration, when Portuguese caravels pushed westward into the vast and uncharted Atlantic, cartographers marked more than just land and sea upon their charts. They inscribed warnings, prayers, and boundaries between the known world and realms that belonged to something altogether darker. Among these ominous notations, one name appeared repeatedly on maps drafted in the 1500s, always positioned west of the Azores archipelago, always accompanied by symbols that made even hardened sailors cross themselves in fear. Satanazes, Satan's Island, a place where the ocean itself was said to burn with the fires of damnation, where geography ended and hell began. The Portuguese maritime empire of the 16th century represented the pinnacle of nautical achievement. These were men who had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, who had charted routes to India and Brazil, who had faced storms that could swallow entire fleets. Yet even among these veteran sailors, there existed routes they would not take, coordinates they would not approach, and waters they spoke of only in whispers after nightfall. The region west of the Azores, that lonely stretch of Atlantic where Satanazes was marked, became a maritime dead zone, not because of rocks or currents, but because of something the sailors believed dwelled there, something that wanted their souls. The earliest references to Satanazes appear on the Pisigano chart of 1424, though the legend likely predates even this ancient map. The island is drawn with unusual detail for a phantom landmass, complete with bays and inlets, suggesting that someone, at some point, claimed to have seen it clearly enough to sketch its coastline. But it was the annotations surrounding the island that revealed its true nature. Written in the flowing script of medieval Portuguese and Latin, the warnings spoke of sulfurous vapors rising from the sea, of water that boiled without natural cause, of screams that carried across the waves on windless nights. These were not the cautious notes of men uncertain about reefs or shoals. These were the terrified warnings of sailors who believed they had glimpsed the very mouth of hell opening upon the ocean. According to the accounts that filtered back to Lisbon and Porto in the early 1500s, ships that ventured too near the coordinates of Satanazes reported phenomena that defied all natural explanation. Captains logged observations of mists that glowed with an inner light the color of dying embers, fog so thick and acrid that men coughed blood after breathing them. The sulfurous stench was described in detail so consistent across multiple testimonies that historians struggled to dismiss it entirely. Sailors spoke of air that tasted of brimstone and decay, a smell so overpowering that crews vomited over the rails, convinced they were inhaling the exhalations of damnation itself. But it was the sounds that truly unmanned even the bravest mariners. Night after night, according to the ship logs that survived, crews heard screaming across the water, not the cries of gulls or the crash of waves against rocks, but distinctly human voices raised in agony, sometimes individual, sometimes in terrible chorus. The accounts describe voices that seemed to come from beneath the waves, as though the damned were crying out from some submarine perdition. Men who heard these screams reported that they seemed to call out in languages both familiar and alien, sometimes speaking in Portuguese or Spanish, begging for rescue, pleading for mercy, cursing God with such vehemence that sailors stuffed their ears with wax to avoid the blasphemy. One particularly detailed account, preserved in the Maritime archives of Lisbon, describes the experience of the caravel Nossa Senhora da Esperança, which sailed too close to the recorded position of Satanazes in 1507. The captain, a veteran navigator named Gaspar Corte Real, kept meticulous records of what his crew experienced during 3 days, trapped in what he described as the devil's own waters. According to his log, the ship encountered a bank of fog that appeared suddenly despite clear skies in all directions. The fog was not white or gray but carried a yellowish tinge, and it stank of sulfur so intensely that several men fainted at their posts. As the Esperanza drifted through this unnatural mist, unable to see more than a few feet beyond the bow, the crew began to hear voices. At first, they thought another ship was nearby, perhaps in distress, but as they called out, the voices responded with laughter that Corte-Real described as not of this earth, but of the pit. Throughout that first night, the crew reported seeing lights moving through the fog, not the steady glow of lanterns but flickering flames that danced across the water's surface without consuming anything, burning atop the waves themselves as though the sea had become combustible. The second day brought even worse terrors. According to the captain's log, several crew members claimed to see land through gaps in the fog, a dark shoreline of jagged rocks beneath cliffs that seemed to glow red from within, as though the island itself was hollow and filled with fire. But whenever Corte-Real adjusted course to approach or avoid this land, it vanished, only to reappear in a different direction entirely. The island, if it was indeed an island, seemed to move around them, or perhaps they were moving in ways that defied the compass and stars. The navigational instruments behaved erratically, the compass needle spinning without settling, the astrolabe readings making no geometric sense. Throughout this ordeal, the screaming continued, growing louder as night fell again. The crew became convinced that the voices belonged to other sailors who had ventured too close to Satanazes and been claimed by whatever dark power resided there. Some men swore they recognized voices, claiming to hear shipmates from previous voyages who had been lost at sea, now crying out from some watery hell. The psychological toll was immense. Corte-Real recorded that 3 men attempted to throw themselves overboard, certain that drowning quickly would be preferable to whatever fate awaited them if they remained. They had to be restrained and confined below deck. On the 3rd day, the wind finally changed, and the Esperanza managed to escape the fog bank. When they emerged and took their bearings, Corte-Real discovered they had drifted nearly 40 leagues from their last confirmed position, far more than wind and current could account for. 5 crew members were missing, though whether they had jumped overboard during the night or been taken by something else, no one could say. The captain noted in his final entry about the incident that every man aboard had aged visibly, their hair grayer, their faces haggard, as though the 3 days near Satanazes had extracted years from their lives. This account, while among the most detailed, was far from unique. Throughout the 16th century, similar testimonies accumulated in the maritime records of Portugal and Spain. Captains reported entire crews refusing to sail certain routes, demanding that ships take longer, more dangerous paths around the Cape of Africa rather than risk the waters where Satanazes was marked. The Spanish crown even issued official dispensations allowing ships to deviate from their chartered courses if the captain deemed they were approaching the cursed coordinates, a remarkable acknowledgement of the fear this phantom island inspired. The cartographers themselves seemed uncertain how to handle Satanazes. Some maps depicted it clearly, a substantial landmass complete with topographical details. Others showed only a vague outline with question marks and warning symbols. A few charts from the mid-1500s show the island drawn in red ink rather than the usual black, a color typically reserved for marking extreme dangers or forbidden zones. What remained consistent across nearly all maps of the era was the presence of some notation about supernatural danger, whether through explicit text warnings or through symbols of demons, skulls, or flames. The psychological dimension of Satanazes reveals much about the medieval maritime worldview. These sailors lived in an era when the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was considered permeable, where God and Satan were understood as active forces in the material world. The ocean, vast and unknowable, became a natural location for supernatural encounter. If demons walked the earth, as medieval theology insisted they did, then surely they could also dwell in the water, could claim islands and currents as their domain. For sailors already operating at the edge of human endurance, facing storms and scurvy, navigating by crude instruments and guesswork, the idea of Satanazes tapped into their deepest fears. It suggested that even perfect navigation and favorable winds might not save you, that there existed zones where the normal rules of seamanship meant nothing, where a different set of laws applied, laws written not by nature, but by malevolent intelligence. The island became a focal point for maritime anxiety, a geographical location for the terror of being lost at sea, not just physically but spiritually, of dying beyond the reach of Christian burial or salvation. The persistence of Satanazes on maps well into the 1700s, even as other phantom islands were debunked and removed, suggests the power this legend held over the maritime imagination. Long after the age of exploration had mapped most of the Atlantic, cartographers continued to include at least a notation about dangerous waters in the region west of the Azores. Some historians argue this persistence stemmed from legitimate navigational hazards in the area, unusual currents, or weather patterns that sailors misinterpreted through the lens of their beliefs. Others point to possible volcanic activity, submarine vents releasing sulfurous gases that could indeed create the described effects of foul-smelling mists and boiling water. Yet these rational explanations feel insufficient when confronted with the sheer consistency and emotional intensity of the accounts. The sailors who encountered Satanazes were not naive or superstitious by the standards of their time. They were professional mariners, many of them veterans of decades at sea, men who knew the difference between a storm and a calm, between fog and smoke, between the natural creaking of a ship and something else entirely. Their terror was real, their conviction absolute. They believed, with a certainty that cost some of them their sanity and others their lives, that they had encountered geography touched by damnation, that they had sailed into waters where hell itself leaked into the world. On the 22nd of March, 1997, a team of Mexican government surveyors boarded a research vessel in the Gulf of Mexico with coordinates that had existed on maps for over 4 centuries. They were searching for Bermeja Island, a strategic piece of land that appeared on every official chart since the 1500s, sitting approximately 62 nautical miles north of the Yucatan Peninsula. The mission was routine, almost mundane. They needed to verify the island's exact position to establish Mexico's maritime border with the United States, a line that would determine which nation controlled billions of dollars worth of offshore oil reserves in an area known as the Western Gap. The surveyors brought sophisticated GPS equipment, sonar mapping technology, and weather-resistant surveying instruments. They had clear coordinates: 22 degrees 33 minutes north latitude, 91 degrees 22 minutes west longitude. The sky was cloudless, visibility perfect. When they arrived at the exact location where Bermeja should have risen from the Gulf waters, they found nothing but open ocean. The initial reaction was confusion, not alarm. Perhaps the historical coordinates were slightly off. Perhaps centuries of map-making before satellite technology had introduced minor errors. The team expanded their search radius, circling outward from the original position. They deployed sonar to scan the seafloor, thinking perhaps the island had subsided just below the surface. For days, they searched a grid pattern covering hundreds of square miles. The ocean depth in the area registered between 1,500 and 4,000 feet. There was no shallow shelf, no underwater mountain that might once have breached the surface, no geological formation that could remotely support the existence of an island. Bermeja had vanished completely, as if it had been plucked from the ocean like a magician's trick. The problem was this: Bermeja Island wasn't some obscure cartographic curiosity. It was the northern anchor point for Mexico's territorial claims in the Gulf. According to international maritime law, a nation's exclusive economic zone extends 200 nautical miles from its coastline and any islands under its sovereignty. Bermeja's location meant that Mexico could claim a massive triangle of ocean extending far into the Gulf, an area estimated to contain oil and natural gas reserves worth potentially $200 billion. Without Bermeja, that claim collapsed. The maritime boundary shifted dramatically southward, placing the disputed Western Gap and its Donut Hole region squarely in international waters, free for exploitation by any nation with the technology to extract its resources. The United States, with its advanced deep-water drilling capabilities, stood to benefit enormously from Bermeja's disappearance. The historical record of Bermeja seemed unquestionable. The island first appeared on a Spanish map created by Alonso de Santa Cruz in 1539, labeled clearly as a small island in the Gulf. Throughout the colonial period, Spanish cartographers consistently included it. The renowned mapmaker Geronimo de Chaves featured Bermeja in his 1568 Atlas. It appeared on Dutch charts, British Admiralty maps, and French naval surveys. When Mexico gained independence in 1821, the new nation inherited Spain's territorial claims, including Bermeja. Mexican government maps continued to show the island through the 19th and 20th centuries. As late as 1997, official Mexican charts marked its position. This wasn't a fleeting reference, or a single cartographer's mistake. This was 400 years of consistent documentation across multiple nations and map-making traditions. Yet no verified landing on Bermeja exists in the historical record. No detailed description of its terrain, vegetation, or wildlife. No reports from fishermen using it as a landmark or shelter. No documented shipwrecks upon its shores. No photographs, even from the 20th century when aerial surveillance became common. The island existed purely on paper, a phantom that persisted through sheer cartographic inertia, each new generation of mapmakers copying from their predecessors without independent verification. When the Mexican government announced that Bermeja could not be located, the response was immediate and explosive. Senators called for investigations. Newspapers ran sensational headlines. And almost immediately, the conspiracy theories began. The most popular theory pointed directly at the Central Intelligence Agency. According to this narrative, American intelligence operatives had destroyed Bermeja deliberately to prevent Mexico from claiming the oil-rich waters. The method, conspiracy theorists suggested, was relatively simple: plant explosives on the island and detonate them, pulverizing the landmass and allowing the fragments to sink beneath the waves. The motive was obvious. With global oil prices volatile and American energy security a constant concern, eliminating Mexico's territorial claim would open the Western Gap to American companies. The timing seemed suspicious too. The Mexican surveys occurred as the two nations negotiated a new maritime treaty, the precise moment when Bermeja's existence mattered most. Proponents of the CIA destruction theory offered supporting evidence. They noted that the United States possessed deepwater demolition technology and had conducted numerous covert operations in Latin America throughout the Cold War. They pointed to the billions of dollars at stake, arguing that such wealth justified extreme measures. Some claimed that seismographic data from the 1980s showed unexplained tremors in the Bermeja region, consistent with underwater explosions. Others suggested that satellite imagery had been deliberately scrubbed or classified to hide evidence of the island's destruction. Mexican Senator Angel Augusto Castillo Montiel became the theory's most vocal advocate. In 2009, he officially called for an investigation, stating publicly that he believed the United States had destroyed Bermeja to rob Mexico of its rightful resources. He commissioned studies, consulted with geologists, and demanded that the Mexican government treat Bermeja's disappearance as a potential act of sabotage. The senator's accusations received widespread media coverage, tapping into deep-seated anxieties about American intervention in Mexican affairs and the long history of resource exploitation. But the CIA conspiracy faces significant logical problems. Destroying an island completely is not a simple undertaking. Bermeja, according to historical descriptions, was several kilometers across. The amount of explosives needed to pulverize such a landmass and scatter it across the ocean floor would be enormous, requiring multiple operations and risking detection. More importantly, the ocean depth in the area is substantial. If Bermeja had been destroyed in the 1980s or 90s, debris fields would still be detectable on the seafloor. Modern sonar can identify geological anomalies with remarkable precision. Yet, multiple surveys have found nothing. No rubble fields, no unusual debris patterns, no evidence whatsoever of recent geological disruption. The second major theory offers a more mundane explanation: climate change and sea level rise. Perhaps Bermeja was a low-lying island or atoll that succumbed to rising ocean levels over the past century. Global sea levels have risen approximately 8 inches since 1900, with the rate accelerating in recent decades. A small, flat island without significant elevation could have been gradually submerged, especially if coastal erosion and storm surges contributed to its degradation. This theory has the advantage of requiring no conspiracy, no deliberate destruction, just natural processes, and bad timing for Mexico's territorial ambition. However, the sea level rise theory also struggles to explain the evidence, or rather, the lack thereof. Even if Bermeja had been submerged, it should still exist as a shallow area, a reef, or a sandbar visible on sonar. The ocean in that region is thousands of feet deep with no shallow formations. For sea level rise to fully erase Bermeja, the island would need to have been extraordinarily fragile, essentially a sandbar that eroded completely over time. But historical maps don't describe Bermeja as a temporary sandbar. They mark it as a permanent island, worthy of notation across centuries. The third possibility is the most unsettling. Bermeja never existed at all. Perhaps it was a cartographic phantom from the beginning, born from a navigation error, a mistaken sighting, or even deliberate fraud. In the age of sail, determining precise longitude was notoriously difficult before the invention of accurate chronometers in the 18th century. Early mapmakers often placed islands incorrectly, sometimes by hundreds of miles. A captain might have spotted land, estimated his position, and reported an island where none existed. That error would then be copied from map to map, gaining credibility through repetition rather than verification. Phantom islands litter historical cartography. The island of Frisland appeared on maps of the North Atlantic for 2 centuries before being proven fictitious. Sandy Island near Australia was on charts until 2012, when an Australian research vessel sailed through its supposed location and found only ocean. Brazil Island supposedly sat west of Ireland for centuries, vanishing and reappearing on maps like a geographical ghost. These cartographic ghosts often originated from honest mistakes, mirage effects, floating ice, or confusion between different reports. Some researchers suggest Bermeja might have been invented deliberately. In the colonial era, claiming territory was sometimes as simple as drawing it on a map. Spanish authorities might have added Bermeja to bolster their territorial claims in the Gulf, knowing that distant islands were rarely verified. Once established on official charts, the fiction became accepted fact, too entrenched to question. For Mexico, the truth about Bermeja matters far less than the consequences of its absence. The 2000 treaties with the United States divided the Gulf based on geography without Bermeja. The Western Gap, an area of approximately 5,500 square miles, fell outside both nations' exclusive economic zones. While both countries agreed to jointly manage the area's resources, the practical reality favored American companies with superior deepwater drilling technology. Mexican officials estimated that the loss of Bermeja-based territorial claims cost the nation access to oil reserves worth over $60 billion at minimum. with some estimates exceeding 200 billion. The geopolitical implications extended beyond money. Mexico's loss of potential territory demonstrated the critical importance of accurate cartography in international law. A nation's borders, its claims to resources, its sovereignty itself, depends on provable geography. When maps lie or contain errors, those mistakes can persist for centuries, shaping treaties and agreements built on false foundations. Bermeja reveals how phantom geography can haunt the modern world, creating financial and political consequences long after the original error occurred. The mystery continues to captivate Mexico. Researchers still occasionally propose new search expeditions. Conspiracy theories flourish online, evolving with each retelling. Some now claim that Bermeja exists, but has been hidden through some classified technology. Others suggest underwater bases or secret drilling operations. The truth likely sits somewhere in the spectrum between honest cartographic error and convenient geological timing, but certainty remains elusive. Bermeja represents a uniquely modern phantom island crisis. Unlike ancient legends of vanished lands, this disappearance carries measurable financial stakes and immediate political ramifications. It demonstrates how the ghosts of bad geography continue to haunt us, how lines drawn on centuries-old maps can determine who controls the resources of tomorrow. And it leaves one haunting question suspended over the Gulf of Mexico. If an island can vanish from maps and memory, taking billions of dollars with it, what else might disappear when we look too closely at the borders we've drawn across the world? Now. The logbook lay open on the captain's desk, the entries growing more frantic with each passing day. Captain Benjamin Morrell dipped his pen into the inkwell with a trembling hand, the motion betraying exhaustion that went beyond mere sleeplessness. It was the spring of 1822, and he had just returned from a voyage that would define the rest of his life, though not in the way he had hoped. He wrote with certainty about islands he had discovered, mapped their coordinates with precision, described their shores in vivid detail. Within a decade, those same discoveries would brand him as either a liar or a madman, and Morrell himself would be unable to tell which verdict terrified him more. Benjamin Morrell was born in Rye, New York, in 1795, the son of a modest family with deep ties to the sea. By the time he reached his 20s, he had already distinguished himself as a capable navigator and fearless explorer, willing to venture into waters that more cautious captains avoided. The South Pacific and Antarctic regions in the early 1800s were still largely unmapped, their waters promising both fortune and peril in equal measure. Seal hunting had become a lucrative business, and entrepreneurs sought new hunting grounds with the fervor of gold prospectors. Morrell commanded the schooner Wasp, later the Antarctic, vessels that would carry him into waters where ice met mystery and where the line between discovery and delusion grew dangerously thin. His first major expedition departed in 1822, bound for the South Pacific and the unexplored reaches of the Antarctic waters. Morrell was not merely a seal hunter seeking profit. He possessed the soul of a true explorer, meticulously recording observations, taking coordinates, sketching coastlines. When he returned to port in 1824, his logbook contained accounts of numerous islands he claimed to have discovered. He reported finding New South Greenland, a substantial landmass in the Antarctic region at approximately 64 degrees south latitude. He described verdant islands in the South Pacific, providing specific coordinates, detailed descriptions of their geography, their potential resources, and their strategic value. The maritime community initially received his reports with interest. Here was a young captain with apparent credentials, backed by logbooks that seemed professional and detailed. Publishers took notice, and Morrell began preparing an account of his voyages for publication. The book, titled A Narrative of 4 Voyages to the South Sea, North and South Pacific Ocean, Chinese Sea, Ethiopic and Southern Atlantic Ocean, Indian and Antarctic Ocean, was published in 1832. It was an ambitious title for an ambitious claim, and it would become the cornerstone of both his fame and his ruin. Other captains began attempting to locate Morrell's discoveries. They sailed to the coordinates he had provided, using his descriptions as guides, expecting to find the islands he had so confidently mapped. They found nothing. Where Morrell had charted New South Greenland, there was only open ocean. The Pacific islands he had described in such detail simply did not exist at the positions he had specified. One expedition after another returned with the same frustrating report. No land, no islands, nothing but empty sea. The whispers began quietly at first, in the taverns near the docks, where sailors gathered to share stories and compare notes. Some suggested that Morrell had simply made errors in his navigation, that his instruments had been faulty or his calculations mistaken. These were the charitable interpretations. Others were less kind. They said he had fabricated the discoveries entirely, inventing islands to secure funding for future voyages, or to sell a sensational book. The word fraud began to attach itself to his name like barnacles to a ship's hull, impossible to scrape away. What made Morrell's case particularly troubling was the specificity of his claims. These were not vague reports of distant lands glimpsed through fog. He had provided precise coordinates, detailed descriptions, careful observations. He had sketched maps. His logbooks contained daily entries, weather observations, interactions with indigenous peoples on some of these phantom islands. Either he was a remarkably talented liar who had gone to extraordinary lengths to fabricate evidence, or something far stranger had occurred. Morrell refused to accept that his discoveries were anything but real. As his reputation crumbled, he became increasingly desperate to vindicate himself. He organized new expeditions, mortgaging his future on voyages intended to relocate the islands that had made him famous and then destroyed him. In 1829, he set sail again, retracing his earlier routes, searching for the lands he swore he had walked upon. The crew watched their captain with growing unease as he stood at the rail for hours, scanning the horizon with an intensity that bordered on mania. His second wife, Abby J. Morrell, accompanied him on some of these later voyages. Her own published account provides a window into the captain's deteriorating state. She described a man consumed by obsession, who would wake in the night, insisting he could smell the vegetation of his lost islands on the wind. He would order sudden course changes based on intuitions he could not explain, convinced that the islands had somehow shifted from their original positions. The crew grew superstitious, some believing their captain had been cursed, others simply convinced he had lost his mind to the endless horizons and the psychological weight of his failed redemption. The logbook entries from these later voyages reveal a man trapped between worlds, unable to reconcile what his memory insisted was true with what the ocean refused to reveal. He wrote about dreams where the islands called to him, where he could see their shores with perfect clarity, only to wake and find nothing but water in every direction. He began developing theories, each more desperate than the last. Perhaps the islands were on moving ice floes that had drifted from their charted positions. Perhaps magnetic anomalies in the region had thrown off his instruments, but also somehow affected every other captain who had sought the same locations. Perhaps uncharted currents had caused his ship to drift far off course without his knowledge, and his coordinates were wrong, but his observations were genuine. In his more lucid moments, recorded in marginalia that grew increasingly cramped and frantic, Morrell seemed to grapple with the possibility that his own mind had betrayed him. Maritime-induced psychosis was not well understood in the 1800s, but sailors knew its symptoms well enough. Long voyages, particularly in the extreme conditions of the Antarctic and remote Pacific, could do strange things to a man's perception. The endless sameness of the ocean, the isolation, the bizarre light effects caused by ice crystals and atmospheric conditions, all could conspire to create hallucinations that seemed utterly real. Entire crews had reported seeing phantom ships or impossible coastlines, only to have them vanish upon approach. But those were momentary delusions, not detailed discoveries mapped over days or weeks. Some modern researchers have attempted to explain Morrell's phantom islands through natural phenomena. Mirages caused by temperature inversions can project images of distant lands across vast stretches of ocean, making islands appear where none exist. Icebergs and ice sheets can resemble coastlines from a distance, particularly in the uncertain light of polar regions. Perhaps Morrell had genuinely believed he was charting real land, when in fact he was mapping temporary formations or atmospheric illusions. This explanation grants him honesty while questioning his judgment, positioning him as a victim of nature's deceptions rather than a deliberate fraud. But this rational explanation struggles to account for all the details in Morrell's accounts. He claimed to have gone ashore on some of these islands, to have collected specimens, to have interacted with inhabitants. Either these were elaborate fabrications, or something inexplicable had indeed occurred during those voyages in the 1820s. The most chilling entries in Morrell's final logbooks are those where he seems to abandon the attempt to rationalize his experiences. In his last known voyage in the early 1839, his entries take on an almost dreamlike quality. He writes about islands that appear and disappear with the tides, landmasses that exist only in certain light or at certain times of year. He describes a growing conviction that the ocean itself is not fixed, that in the remote waters where he sailed, the boundary between the real and the impossible grows thin. Some passages suggest he believed he had sailed into regions where normal laws did not apply, where islands could exist and not exist simultaneously, where his discoveries were real but unreachable by ordinary means. His final entry, dated sometime in 1839, is fragmentary and disturbing. He writes about seeing his islands again, about finally understanding why no one else could find them. The entry breaks off mid-sentence, the ink trailing away as if the pen had fallen from his hand. What happened to Captain Benjamin Morrell after this point remains uncertain. Some accounts claim he died at sea in 1839, though the circumstances are vague and poorly documented. Others suggest he simply disappeared, last seen in some remote port, still searching for the vindication that eluded him. No definitive proof has ever emerged to confirm or definitively disprove Morrell's discoveries. New South Greenland does not exist at the coordinates he provided, this much is certain. But the Antarctic and sub-Antarctic regions are treacherous and difficult to map, and ice formations can appear remarkably stable before breaking apart and drifting away. Some of the Pacific islands he claimed to discover have been tentatively identified with real locations, their coordinates perhaps miscalculated rather than fabricated. But others remain complete mysteries, places described in such detail that it seems impossible they were invented, yet equally impossible that they exist. The tragedy of Benjamin Morrell lies not just in his ruined reputation or mysterious end, but in the fundamental uncertainty that consumed him. He died, if he died, never knowing whether he had been a discoverer or a madman, whether his islands had been real or hallucinations born of sun glare on infinite water. His legacy exists in that terrible space between exploration and illusion, a reminder that the human mind is itself an unmapped territory, capable of creating geographies as detailed and convincing as any real landscape. In the vastness of the ocean, where a man might sail for weeks without seeing land, where ice and light and exhaustion conspire to blur perception, what is the difference between a discovered island and an imagined one? Morrell could never answer that question, and perhaps that uncertainty is what finally destroyed him. The psychological weight of living in a world that insisted his most significant accomplishments had never existed at all. On the 12th of November, 2012, the research vessel Southern Surveyor cut through the coral sea waters between Australia and New Caledonia with a specific purpose. The crew of Australian scientists aboard had coordinates locked into their navigation systems, a destination marked clearly on their digital charts. Sandy Island, Ja, a landmass that appeared on Google Earth, on marine charts issued by the French Hydrographic Office, and in the database of every major mapping service available to the modern world. The island measured roughly 15 miles long and 3 miles wide according to these sources, large enough to be significant, real enough to be documented, or so everyone believed. What happened next would shake the foundations of what we trust about modern cartography, about the technology we assume to be infallible, about the very way we understand our planet in the age of satellites and GPS. The ship's captain, Fred Stein, watched his instruments as they approached the coordinates: 26 degrees south, 159 degrees east. The exact location where Sandy Island should rise from the Pacific waters. The weather was clear that day. Visibility stretched to the horizon in every direction. These were ideal conditions for spotting land. The crew gathered on deck as they drew closer, anticipation building. They were about to set foot on an island that few had documented in detail, a remote speck of land that had somehow remained relatively unexplored despite appearing on maps for over a century. But the horizon remained empty. Nothing but endless blue water meeting endless blue sky. The scientists checked their instruments, rechecked them. The GPS confirmed they were at the precise coordinates. The ship slowed, then stopped, floating directly over where Sandy Island's northernmost shore should begin. Dr. Maria Seton, the expedition's chief scientist, stared at the depth sounder readings. The ocean floor measured over 4,000 feet below them. No landmass. No underwater shelf that might indicate a sunken island. No shoals or reefs breaking the surface. Just the abyssal depths of the Coral Sea, uninterrupted and indifferent. They sailed a grid pattern across the entire area where the island supposedly existed, covering every square mile that should have been solid ground. The crew members later described an unsettling sensation during those hours. An existential dread that crept over them as they motored through coordinates that their screens insisted should be blocking their path. One crew member, whose testimony was recorded in the expedition logs, said it felt like sailing through a ghost, passing through a space where reality and information had somehow become uncoupled. The GPS showed the island. The charts showed the island. But their eyes, the most ancient of human navigation tools, showed only void. How does a landmass 15 miles long simply not exist? How does it appear on modern satellite imagery? How does an island survive into the digital age, replicated across mapping systems worldwide, when it is nothing more than empty ocean? The story of Sandy Island's phantom existence stretches back to the 19th century. The earliest known reference appears on a whaling ship's chart from 1876, created by the whaling ship Velocity. The captain reported land in that location, a practice common amongst sailors of that era who were encouraged to document any geographic features they encountered. These reports were compiled by cartographers, who created the master charts used by navies and merchant fleets worldwide. Once an island appeared on an authoritative chart, it would be copied to others, propagating through the world's geographic knowledge like a virus replicating through a network. But here's where the story becomes darker, more complex. Multiple ships, in subsequent decades, reported sailing through the same coordinates and finding nothing. As early as the 1920s, mariners had documented the absence of any landmass at that location. These reports existed in maritime records, in ships' logs, in official notifications to hydrographic offices. Yet Sandy Island persisted on charts. The error should have been corrected. The phantom should have been excised from our maps. Instead, it multiplied. Throughout the 20th century, as old paper charts were digitized and converted into electronic databases, Sandy Island made the transition from ink to pixels without scrutiny. The cartographic companies building digital mapping systems in the 1980s and 90s pulled data from various sources, including those French hydrographic charts that still showed the island. When Google began assembling Google Earth and Google Maps in the early 2000s, they aggregated data from multiple providers. Sandy Island appeared in enough sources that the algorithms accepted it as verified. No human cartographer apparently questioned it. No satellite analyst noticed that the imagery showed only water where the vector data indicated land. This is the truly disturbing part. In an age of satellite photography capable of reading license plates from orbit, Sandy Island survived. The mapping systems did what they were programmed to do. They compiled data, averaged it, trusted the sources marked as authoritative, but they didn't verify it against observable reality. The satellite images that should have revealed the truth were somehow never properly compared to the charts. Or if they were, the discrepancy was attributed to error in the imagery rather than error in the data. The map had become more trusted than the territory. The French Hydrographic Service, Service Hydrographique et Océanographique et la Marine, kept Sandy Island on their official nautical charts used by military and commercial vessels well into the 21st century. These weren't dusty antique maps in a museum. These were active, current, officially sanctioned charts that sailors relied upon for navigation. The French military, with all its resources and technology, was directing ships to treat as real an island that did not exist. When the Southern Surveyor's findings were published, the response from the cartographic community revealed a deeper problem. Officials admitted they had no clear explanation for how the error persisted. The French Hydrographic Service removed the island from their charts within weeks, a quiet correction to a century-spanning mistake. Google Earth updated its database, erasing the polygon that had represented Sandy Island. Within months, the island vanished from nearly every digital mapping service, removed with a few keystrokes, as though it had never existed at all. But the implications remain. and they are profoundly unsettling. If a 15-mile-long island can appear on modern GPS systems, on Google Maps, on official military charts, when it is actually just empty ocean, what else might be wrong? What other geographic features do we accept as real, simply because our screens tell us they are? How many other phantom islands exist in our databases, unchecked, unverified, waiting for someone to actually sail to their coordinates and find nothing but waves? The crew testimonies from the Southern Surveyor describe more than just scientific surprise. They describe a visceral unease, a sense that something fundamental about their understanding of the world had fractured. These were experienced sailors and scientists, people who spent their lives studying the ocean, trusting instruments, believing in the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. To watch those instruments confidently declare the presence of land while standing on deck and seeing only emptiness created a kind of cognitive dissonance that several crew members said took days to fully process. Dr. Seaton later reflected that the experience forced her to question other accepted geographic facts. If this could be wrong, what else might be? She wasn't alone in that thought. Cartographers reviewing their databases after the Sandy Island revelation found other suspicious features. Several more phantom islands were identified and removed from mapping systems. Some had been there for decades. Others dated back centuries, but had made the digital transition without ever being physically verified. The problem extends beyond islands. There are disputed borders marked differently on various national mapping services, each claiming authority. There are features named on some maps but not others, their very existence uncertain. There are depth soundings in remote ocean areas that have never been verified by modern survey equipment, copied forward from measurements taken by lead lines dropped from sailing ships 200 years ago. Our digital maps give an impression of complete, verified knowledge. They appear authoritative, comprehensive, checked and double-checked by armies of technicians, and verified by satellite constellations constantly photographing the Earth's surface. But underneath that confident interface lies layers of historical data, some of it wrong, some of it guessed, some of it simply copied from previous maps without verification. The existential dread the crew felt sailing through Sandy Island's coordinates speaks to something deeper than cartographic error. It touches on our need to trust the systems we've built, to believe that our technology has mastered the fundamental task of knowing where things are. GPS has become so reliable, so ubiquitous, that we've stopped questioning it. We follow its directions implicitly, trusting it to guide us through unknown territory. But GPS can only tell you what its database contains, and if that database is wrong, the technology delivers falsehood with the same confident precision it delivers truth. In the age of satellite imagery and digital mapping, we assume these problems were solved. Phantom islands were supposed to be artifacts of the age of sail, of foggy sightings and uncertain navigation, of maps drawn from travelers' tales and wishful thinking. That such a phantom could survive into 2012, appearing on the most advanced mapping systems humans had ever created, reveals a flaw in our assumption of progress. We believed that more technology meant more truth, that digital systems had transcended the errors of their analog predecessors. Sandy Island proved we had simply digitized old errors and given them new life in databases we trusted more than our own eyes. The island is gone now from our maps, erased as easily as it was originally drawn. But the question remains, hanging over every map we consult, every GPS coordinate we trust. What else isn't there? What other voids masquerade as solid ground in the databases that guide our ships, our planes, our understanding of the planet we inhabit? The answer is unknowable until someone, somewhere, happens to sail through the coordinates and finds only water where certainty should be, only void where our maps promise land. The maps should not have shown it. For 540 years, cartographers marked an island west of Ireland that defied every rule of geography and reason. They called it Hy-Brasil, and it appeared on maritime charts from 1325 until 1865, placed with the same careful precision used for England, France, and Spain. But Hy-Brasil had one quality that separated it from every other landmass on those maps. It was not always there. According to the ancient legends, the island revealed itself only once every 7 years, emerging from veils of impenetrable mist that concealed it from mortal eyes. When it did appear, Sailors who glimpsed it through the fog described towers of black stone rising from cliffs that seemed older than the ocean itself. Most phantom islands eventually vanished from maps when exploration proved them non-existent. Hy-Brasil remained, documented and redocumented across centuries, because people kept insisting they had been there. They described its shores. They drew its harbors. Some brought back proof. The summer of 1674 began like any other for Captain John Nisbet, master of a merchant vessel sailing from the port of Killybegs in County Donegal. His reputation was solid, his crew experienced, his route familiar. These were not superstitious men prone to flights of fancy or drink-addled visions. They were professional sailors who understood wind, tide, and the difference between fog banks and landmasses, which makes what happened next impossible to dismiss as simple delusion or mass hysteria. The official testimony, recorded by multiple witnesses and preserved in historical archives, states that Captain Nisbet's ship encountered heavy fog approximately 30 leagues west of Ireland's coast. When the mist briefly parted, they saw land where their charts showed only open ocean. Not a small rock or reef, but a substantial island with visible harbors and what appeared to be stone structures along its elevated interior. Every man on deck saw it. They argued about what to do. The fog was dangerous, the location wrong, yet the island was undeniably there. Nisbet made the decision to investigate. They dropped anchor in a natural harbor, and 4 men rowed ashore in the longboat, including the captain himself. What they described upon their return would haunt maritime records for centuries. They claimed to have walked on solid ground, touched walls of stone, carved with symbols none of them recognized, and encountered people, not primitive islanders or shipwreck survivors, but inhabitants of what appeared to be an ancient civilization, dressed in clothing of unfamiliar design, and speaking a language that resembled Irish Gaelic, but seemed older, as if they were hearing the root from which modern tongues had grown. The strangest detail in their testimony was the behavior of these inhabitants. They showed no surprise at the sailors' arrival, as if visitors from the outside world were expected, or perhaps remembered from previous encounters. They were welcoming but formal, conducting themselves with the bearing of people who existed outside normal time, unhurried and serene. The beings, for the crew hesitated to call them simply men and women, offered hospitality. They gave the sailors food that tasted unlike anything from Ireland or Europe, and they gave them gifts. When Captain Nisbet's ship returned to Scotland, he carried physical objects that should not have existed. Silver coins of unknown origin, worked with craftsmanship that exceeded anything produced in 17th century Europe. Gold ornaments of a design that matched no known culture. These items were examined, documented, and caused immediate controversy. They were undeniably real, solid, weighing what silver and gold should weigh, yet their existence supported an impossible story. Skeptics suggested Nisbet had acquired them through other means and fabricated the island tale. But to what purpose? The captain gained nothing but mockery and suspicion from his account. He was not seeking fame or profit from the story. In fact, the testimony seemed to trouble him deeply. Multiple crew members gave consistent accounts, separately and under questioning. They described the same harbor, the same stone structures, the same inhabitants. Years later, as old men, they would still swear on holy relics that they had walked on Hy-Brasil. Some went to their graves insisting the island was real, refusing to recant even when it would have been easier to admit to a shared delusion or hoax. Men do not typically die defending lies that bring them only ridicule. The Celtic legends surrounding Hy-Brasil stretch back far beyond medieval maps, into the mythological foundations of Irish culture itself. The ancient tales speak of it as Tir na Nog, the land of the young, where immortal beings dwelled beyond the reach of time and death. It was said to be a place where the Tuatha De Danann, the supernatural race that inhabited Ireland before humans, were treated when mortal men claimed the visible world. The island existed in a state between the physical and the otherworldly, accessible only at certain times when the barrier between worlds grew thin. According to these legends, those who reached Hy-Brasil and returned were forever changed. Time moved differently there. A single day on the island might equal 7 years in the mortal world, or 7 years might pass in a single afternoon. The inhabitants possessed knowledge forbidden to ordinary humans, secrets of nature and existence that predated written history. They could grant gifts of prophecy, healing, or extended life, But such gifts came with a price. Those who accepted them could never fully return to the world they had left. Part of them remained on the island, caught between states of being. The legends warned that some who visited Hy-Brasil chose never to leave. The promise of immortality, of existence without suffering or aging, proved too powerful to resist. They would send messages back to their families, claiming they had found paradise and would return soon, but that return never came. Their loved ones would wait years, decades, and eventually accept that the island had claimed them. Whether this was death or transformation, the stories never made clear. Perhaps on Hy-Brasil, there was no difference between the two. What elevates Hy-Brasil above other phantom islands is the persistence of the physical evidence that contradicts its non-existence. Beyond Captain Nisbet's artifacts, multiple expeditions reported similar findings. In 1479, a Scottish voyage specifically seeking the island claimed to have reached it, and brought back mysterious stones carved with spirals and symbols. In 1630, another crew reported landing and encountering ruins of a vast city, empty but perfectly preserved, as if its inhabitants had simply stepped away moments before. The island appeared on maps, created by the finest cartographers of their eras. The Catalan Atlas of 1375 showed it clearly. The famous Pizzigani chart of 1367 marked it as Brasil. Abraham Ortelius, whose Theatrum Orbius Terrarum of 1570 became the first modern atlas, included Hy-Brasil west of Ireland. These were not superstitious monks illuminating manuscripts with sea serpents and fantasy. These were scholars attempting to document the known world with accuracy. Why would they repeatedly include an island that did not exist? Some researchers suggest Hy-Brasil might have been a misidentification of the actual island of Porcupine Bank, a shallow area of the continental shelf that occasionally creates unusual wave patterns and fog effects. But Porcupine Bank is a submerged feature, not a landmass with harbors and stone structures. It cannot account for the detailed descriptions of buildings, inhabitants, and physical artifacts that witnesses reported. The explanations break down when confronted with the specificity of the testimonies. This is where Hy-Brasil becomes more than a cartographic error or a sailor's tale. It represents the possibility that reality is more fluid than our modern understanding allows. What if some locations exist between dimensions, visible only when conditions align in ways we do not yet comprehend? Quantum physics has revealed that particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. Space and time, we now know, are not the fixed stage we once believed them to be, but can bend, fold, and perhaps intersect in ways that create temporary doorways. The 7-year cycle mentioned in the legends takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. Perhaps Hy-Brasil does not move or hide, but remains in a fixed location that occasionally phase aligns with our dimensional frequency. The inhabitants might not be immortal beings, but simply exist in a time stream that flows at a different rate, making them appear unchanging to visitors from our faster-moving temporal reality. The mist that always surrounds the island, in descriptions, might not be weather, but a visible manifestation of dimensional membrane, the boundary layer between one state of existence and another. Captain Nisbet's testimony includes a detail often overlooked but deeply unsettling. He stated that the inhabitants seemed to know him, though he had never seen them before. They addressed him by name before he introduced himself, and spoke of events from his childhood that he had told no one aboard ship. They treated his arrival not as a first encounter, but as a reunion, as if from their perspective outside linear time, they had already met him, already knew his entire life story from beginning to end. This suggests they existed in a state where past, present, and future were simultaneously accessible, a condition theoretical physics tells us is possible near extreme gravitational fields, or in spaces where the normal flow of causality breaks down. The artifacts Nisbet brought back present another mystery. Modern metallurgical analysis of similar objects from other alleged Phantom Island encounters has revealed anomalies in their composition. The silver contains trace elements in ratios that do not match any known mining sources. The gold shows crystalline structures, inconsistent with any documented refining process used in human history. These are not medieval forgeries or misidentified relics from known civilizations. They are real objects of unknown origin, physical evidence of something that should not exist. Consider what it means that men died swearing they had been there. In an age when religious faith held tremendous power, when eternal salvation depended on truth-telling, experienced sailors faced death, insisting Hy-Brasil was real. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Their reputations suffered, their families faced shame, yet they refused to recant. This is not the behavior of hoaxers or the deluded. This is the behavior of people who experienced something so profound, so undeniably real, that denying it would be a greater lie than any ridicule they suffered for speaking the truth. The last official sighting of Hy-Brasil appeared in 1865, when a British survey vessel reported an island in the traditional location, shrouded in fog, before losing sight of it as weather conditions changed. After that, the island vanished from maps, relegated to legend and dismissed as navigational error. But absence from maps does not equal non-existence. It may simply mean we stopped looking, or stopped trusting what we saw. Hy-Brasil remains the most persistent, most documented, and most troubling phantom island in history because it refuses simple explanation. The evidence suggests it might not be phantom at all, but something far stranger, a real place existing in a state our current understanding of physics cannot fully explain, visible only when the conditions align, inhabited by beings who experience time and reality differently than we do, capable of reaching out and touching our world with gifts of silver and gold and knowledge that we carry back as proof of the impossible. We tell ourselves we've mapped the world. We say we've charted every coastline, measured every depth, cataloged every island in every sea. Our satellites watch from above. Our ships cross and recross the oceans with GPS precision. And yet the phantom islands refuse to behave as solved mysteries should. They linger in the corners of our certainty, whispering questions we cannot answer. Consider what we still don't know. Why do some phantom islands persist across centuries of cartography while others appear on a single chart and vanish forever? Frisland haunted maps for 300 years, copied faithfully by the greatest cartographers of their age. Sandy Island remained on official charts until 2012, despite satellites that could count individual trees on genuine islands. Yet other phantom landmasses appeared once, perhaps twice, and then dissolved into rumor and footnote. What determines their longevity? Is it simply the prestige of the first map they appeared on, the respectability of the original cartographer? Or is something else at work, some quality inherent to the phantom itself that makes certain false islands more persistent, more real than others? Then there are the artifacts, the physical objects that shouldn't exist, stones carved with unknown symbols, supposedly collected from islands that official records insist were never there. Ship logs describing harbors and beaches in positions where ocean depths make land impossible. Photographs of coastlines that don't match any charted territory. These objects resist easy dismissal. They exist. You can hold them. So what are they? If not evidence of something our maps fail to explain? The conventional explanations grow thin when pressed. Cartographical error, we're told. Simple mistakes, propagated through copying. But this doesn't account for multiple independent sightings across centuries. It doesn't explain why experienced navigators, people whose lives depended on accurate observation, repeatedly reported the same non-existent islands in the same impossible location. Mass hallucination becomes the next refuge, but hallucinations don't produce consistent geographical details. They don't appear to multiple ships separated by decades or centuries. They don't leave physical evidence. Perhaps some phantom islands are geological phenomena, not permanent land, but temporary formations that genuinely existed before subsiding again beneath the waves. Volcanic activity creates new islands with startling speed. Earthquakes raise seafloors temporarily. Massive accumulations of pumice can form floating islands large enough to fool sailors. But this explanation, while satisfying for some cases, fails to account for phantoms reported in geologically stable regions, or those that appeared repeatedly over time spans too long for temporary formations. Which brings us to the explanations that challenge our comfortable understanding of reality itself. What if some phantom islands exist outside normal space? What if they occupy dimensional folds, appearing and disappearing according to rules we don't comprehend? This sounds like fantasy, but it offers answers where conventional explanations falter. It explains the inconsistent sightings, the physical artifacts, the genuine conviction of witnesses. It suggests that our maps are not just incomplete but fundamentally inadequate to represent a world stranger than we imagine. The most disturbing possibility is that our maps are simply stories we tell ourselves about a world we don't fully understand. We draw lines and shapes and convince ourselves these represent truth, but perhaps they're just collective fictions, agreements about what reality should contain. Every blank space on every map might conceal islands we've forgotten, places edited out of our shared story because they didn't fit the narrative we wanted to tell. And every island we think we know might be phantom, might dissolve tomorrow into sea and legend, revealed as no more substantial than Frisland or Brazil. The phenomenon continues. New phantom islands are still being discovered, still being erased from our charts. In 2009, researchers found that a supposed island north of Australia had never existed, despite appearing on maps for decades. In 2019, satellite imagery revealed errors in Pacific Island positions that had persisted for years. Each correction is presented as progress, as evidence of our improving accuracy. But each correction is also proof that our maps remain wrong, that phantom islands still proliferate, that we're still mapping fictions alongside facts without knowing which is which. What undiscovered phantoms currently lurk on our charts? What islands are you looking at right now, on maps you trust that don't exist? What real islands have we erased, dismissing them as phantom when they were genuinely there? We can't know. We can only understand that the horror at the heart of phantom islands is not that maps were wrong in the past, but that they remain wrong now, in ways we cannot detect until it's too late. The world is larger and stranger than our charts admit. In the spaces between certainty and impossibility, phantom islands wait. Some are memories of places that existed once. Some are prophecies of places that will exist. And some perhaps are glimpses of places that exist always, just beyond the edge of what we're capable of seeing. Our satellites watch, our ships traverse, but still the phantoms appear and disappear, refusing to be solved, refusing to be dismissed. We tell ourselves we've mapped the world, but the phantom islands know better. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.